David Curington, Mind Maps.
On the eye, against an and 77.
The album Mind Maps is a densely layered web of free association which uses improvisation, sampling, digital and analog processing, and re-record samples in lots of different environments. The release consists of 3 sets of tracks and images. I produced the images first, and then the music followed, which was intended to accompany the image, elaborate on some of the topics involved with some of the material choices. I employed similar techniques in the production of both the music and the photography, as was generated for what I like to call my ambient noise period, which was really during lockdown. But the origins and the connotations of the samples are a bit more clear in this release. The music in this case was very much mixed, as was the photography, rather than simply layered and processed as a whole, a bit like a painter, perhaps a sort of Gerhard Richter applying layers, using a squeegee board to kind of treat the whole, and then if you don't like that you add more layers on top, and you just keep layering and processing, layering and processing. That was really my approach for all the ambient noise tracks, whereas this one was a little more clarified. The photography was produced in a similar way. It started with quite a large web of associated images and processings of them, but then each was cut and overlaid in a way that really allows each layer to register, rather than just having a blend to form just basically a great aggregate mass of sound. The first track is entitled Monet, Money, Mahogany, and I think the starting point for the track was the idea of ruining things, particularly with the conceptual idea of taking a Monet painting and thinking, well, what would it look like in monochrome, or perhaps oversaturated so that the colours were really sort of clipping and neon rather than a subtle blend of hues. I've been interested for a time in the idea of noise, not noise in terms of literal noise in terms of digital or analog distortion, but more broadly the idea of noise as something failed, the idea of something being unclear or failing to meet a certain set of criteria. But then the work really spiraled into considerations of the art world generally, its commercialization, and sort of absurdist ideas of what colour would be, both musical and visual. One example of this is the sample that enters the track from about halfway through and gradually overwhelms it, these long saturated drones that were produced from taking recordings of Debussy piano preludes, re-recording them in a bathroom through an old cassette player. So you sort of have this sort of fairly extreme analog distortion, and then the great big massive reverb of a bathroom, and these drones just gradually wash over the entire track. The second track is called Maths, Mats, Masks, and the maths bit refers, I suppose, to my day job as a maths tutor. My undergraduate degree is in maths, and math tutoring is how I pay my bills. The starting point with the mathematical content was with revisiting an experiment I had last year with converting math theorems into music, literally, and trying to highlight the structure of them through music. And also another starting point was a bit of an experiment with Super Collider, which I used for the first time, sonifying the Mandelbrot set. The Mandelbrot set, to give a brief explanation, is a set of values in the complex plane that are to do with whether a certain function converges or not with those values being inputted into the function. And the sine tones that you hear in the track are a way of sonifying that. Whether you can really tell or not is completely another matter. But I just wanted a way of generating material that was loosely associated with maths. But a bit like the first track, the sort of association spiraled a bit into imagining perhaps what maths might mean as popular science really in 2021. And a pretty big reference point, I think, now for people with maths is the coronavirus. I don't think anyone would be able to tell you what a R number in an exponential graph might mean before 2020 and 2021. And the track takes an example of a robotic voice coolly reading out coronavirus statistics, and the whole first half of the track is done through heavy noise removal. A lot of my life is currently on Zoom through my tutoring, and half of the track really is as if it was through heavy noise removal software on something like Zoom. The final track of the album is called Mimic Matic Mythic, and it started really with the idea of harmonization with the natural world, harmonization generally, being at peace with oneself, spirituality and the like. Perhaps tapping into my love of animals. My mum was a zookeeper. Maybe that's where it all comes from. My love of animals and nature, which I think was really heightened during lockdown, when the only thing really to get out and do was to go on long walks in the peaks. Another reference point is my pretty limited knowledge of Zen Buddhism. Using Alan Watts as a reference point for popular culture, a lot of the track is based around a recorded Alan Watts lecture. And in this lecture, Alan Watts talks really about the seriousness of theories and the seriousness of various mythologies that seem to have dominated our way of life. Two of them being both Christianity and science, and he refers to them really as koans, which are sort of tests in Zen Buddhism that are set by masters. Mentioning at one point, do they offer good games? And for the bit of the lecture that I've sampled, he's quite critical of Christianity. It ends up being quite critical, but I thought it'd be interesting to sort of go the other way with it. One of the recording I used was off of YouTube, and it came with this sort of fairly tacky, generic kind of ambient sound backing music. And I really sort of hammed that up and went the other way with it, bringing in a sort of synth church organ and tried to morph the things so that it sounded like some sort of quite spiritual Christian church service, whilst at the same time this critical lecture was going on. I thought that would be an interesting confusion. And the track ends with a big line in it where he talks about really the role model that God is, and says, and you should feel grateful, talking about one of the models really for Christianity being that it's this idea of a God, and your life is in debt to this God, and you should be grateful for your life. And I just thought that would be quite a fun line to really project out at the very end of this whole album, that you should feel grateful for it. So that was fun. I really hope listeners enjoy the album when it comes out. It was tremendous fun to make. It was actually made quite quickly. Nowadays, I think when I make stuff, I do sort of have a furious period of activity, but it ends up coming together quite quickly. I do quite a lot of work, and it comes together quite quickly. I hope really that the more you listen to it, you'll pick out new things. It's very much designed with no particular narrative. There's no real takeaway message from any of the tracks. It's really just exploring a dense web with no center. And that's what I think will make it particularly appropriate to cassette release, where you can sort of just dip into different bits of it and you'll pick out new things. It's really completely non-linear. That's how it's intended. As I say, it was great fun to make, and I hope you have great fun listening to it.